Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We're about to begin the press conference by the Bank of Russia Governor, Elvira Nabiullina. And to start with, the Governor will make a statement following the results of the Board of Directors meeting. Good afternoon. Today, the Bank of Russia Board of Directors decided to cut the key rate to 8.5% per annum. And I will dwell upon the factors we considered while making this decision. First, inflation has been held sustainably close to 4%. In August, the rate of inflation totaled 3.3%, following a short-lived rise to 4.4% in June. We regard these price fluctuations triggered by temporary factors to be small-scale and no cause for concern. They are not suggestive of inflation deviating from the target. At this point, let me divert your attention. It is important. With inflation having reached around 4%, we see the need for specifying our target. Our target is inflation close to 4 or around 4%. We say, quote-unquote, close to, because it may go up and down around this reading of 4%. Previously, we spoke on the horizon over which this target could be delivered. That is, we set up the target value for the end of, let's say, 2017. At this point in time, this target becomes permanent, and so we treat it as such. We also discussed a potential numerical range for acceptable inflation deviations, yet we believe it would be premature. At this point in time, and on a case-by-case basis, we intend to analyze and explain the nature of factors behind specific price movements. Such movements can vary in nature and the horizon of impact. Only if we see inflation moving away from target substantially and persistently, we will then take corrective action. Exactly because factors which trigger inflation deviation from target may vary in terms of nature and the horizon of impact, and not every situation will call for responsive action. That is why we believe it would not be tenable to establish this range. For instance, should poor crops translate into a substantial yet short-term off-target inflation episode which makes no impact upon inflation expectation, we will refrain from action. Conversely, if temporary factors prove impactful on inflation expectations and lead to a threat of persistent and durable off-target deviation of inflation, action on our part will be needed. We also leave open the possibility to take preventive action seeking to curb inflation deviation from 4% beforehand if we see that this deviation is sustained over the forecast horizon. And we will take no action whatsoever in the case of minor changes in inflation, provided that it remains around 4%. But let us come back to the present situation. This is exactly the case I have spoken on, because the summer's inflation fluctuations from 4.4 to 3.3% are near target and small scale. And given the nature of price movements, we regard the current rate of inflation kept close to 4% as sustainable. Inflation process across product categories and regions is where we believe that it's already stable around 4%, because the current inflationary processes are quite homogeneous in between different product groups and in between regions, and a greater number of both products and services are posting annualized price growth rates within 4%, and so the prices for products and services which have little exposure to market fluctuations is around 4%. This is reflected in our estimates, where unstable and volatile components of the consumer basket are excluded. Temporal inflation fluctuations are only natural, yet in Russia they are still substantial, which is attributed to structural pricing factors. These include a high proportion of imports in consumption and the pronounced seasonality of price movements in certain product categories and services. Their impact is amplified by unanchored inflation expectations. They combine to make inflation sensitive to exchange rate movements, global food market fluctuations, and current crops. Specifically, the volatility of inflation we have observed in recent months is indeed a consequence of fluctuations in food prices. Notwithstanding the recent investment in agriculture, there are still bottlenecks here. These are mainly storage and processing capacities and transportation. This affects the preservation of crops and leads to instability in food prices. Although food price volatility in itself brings no risk to inflation anchored at 4%, it may be an impactful factor behind the speed at which inflation expectations are reduced. This, as a result, spells the need to maintain the required extent of tightness in the monetary policy. Now, the second factor the board took into account while making the rate decision was the decline in inflation expectations of both households and businesses, which resumed in August following a soft growth in July. Currently, household inflation expectations are at the historic all-time low at 9.5%. However, this is still a high reading. Moreover, inflation expectations remain unanchored. That is, they remain highly sensitive to temporal factors. This is also true of corporate expectations. This nature of inflation expectations works to strengthen risks to inflation sustained close to 4% if certain shocks are to materialize. And in such conditions, the case for maintaining a fairly tight monetary policy stance remains, which, however, suggests a gradual loosening. Third, assessments show that the current monetary conditions are being shaped by beyond the past key rate decisions, which incidentally are only gradually translated into the economy, by expectations as regards future Bank of Russia actions with regard to the rate, both short and medium-term actions. This finds its way in deposit and lending rates declining faster than the Bank of Russia key rate. In particular, since early 2017, the key rate has gone down by 1 percentage point to 9% per annum, and I'm talking about up till now, while interest rates on long-term loans have dropped by 1.8 percentage points to approximately 10% per annum, and those on long-term deposits have declined by 1.2 percentage points to about 8% per annum. The monetary conditions and their evolution are at present serving to help a gradual recovery in consumer demand. The emerging transition from a saving to consumption-focused behavior model is taking place in a smooth way. Admittedly, we have seen a decline in the savings ratio, including on the back of rebounding consumer lending. In an economic upturn, this rise in consumption is a natural phenomenon. The retail sales are on the rise. Recent polls suggest households are willing to make big budget purchases more often. We are also seeing a recovery in demand for the durables. Nonetheless, to reconfirm yet again, what is important is that this process unfolds gradually and comes without an overheated economy and inflationary pressures it entails. No such trends are currently being detected. Consumer spending is expanding mainly on the back of the mounting wages, not consumer credit. Overall, wages in the economy have in turn been showing a balanced growth to date, consistent with a rise in labor productivity without inflationary pressures. Fourth, inflation declines as economic activity is on the rise. In the second quarter, GDP growth exceeded our expectations and those of many experts. The economy has continued to recover in the third quarter. Our estimates suggest that the equilibrium is almost reached in the economy and the labor market, where unemployment has settled just above 5%. The result achieved in the second quarter allowed us to revise the 2017 baseline economic growth forecast to 1.7-2.2%. However, our vision of the mid-term economic development and external environment has remained unchanged. We still believe that oil prices will fall in the first half of 2018 and hold at the average of approximately $40 per barrel in real terms. GDP growth will stand within 2%. Given that the economy is close to the equilibrium, structural constraints should be removed to avoid an increase in inflationary pressure on the back of faster economic growth. Now, a few words on the balance of payments. Over a 3-year horizon, current account balance will follow the downward path of oil prices. The balance will be only slightly positive in 2019-2020. Certain quarters may even see it enter negative territory. Having said that, the balance of payments should be estimated as a whole without any downward pressure upon the exchange rate, and sometimes we see the forecast of the currency exchange rate reliant upon certain taken out of the context balance of payments line items, and this approach is wrong because one should assess the payment balance because its line items are very intricately related, particularly under the environment of the floating exchange rate. And the current account basically conforms to the payment balance, take into account the changes in the factors. And the seasonal fluctuations are quite characteristic because in the first quarter is high, in the second and third lower, and the financial account balance changes accordingly. And in conclusion, I would like to dwell on inflation risks. Given that we aim at a near 4% inflation, there are risks that it may not only exceed this reading, but also fall below it. By such risks, we mean prerequisites for considerable and persistent inflation deviation from 4%. Some factors are currently pressing down on inflation. However, overall inflation risks are skewed upward and midterm in nature. Our estimates suggest that inflation's downward deviation may be triggered by the above-mentioned food price movements. However, we believe it to be short-lived. Growing oil prices assumed in the alternative scenario may be another trigger. Regarding pro-inflationary risks, we are staying focused on the high uncertainty of the external environment, its impact on inflation, exchange rate, and inflation expectations. Inflation may exceed 4% if consumption grows faster than production capacities can sustain. Also, inflation risks may be posed by labor shortages. They can result in a lag between labor productivity growth and wage increase in certain sectors in the economy. This effect may be mitigated by foreign labor migration that restrains real wage movements, and these processes are evident in construction, retail, and agriculture. However, midterm, cheap labor discourages the search for effective technologies, and this may slow growth in labor productivity. Now, given the balance of inflation risks, the Bank of Russia allows for a key rate cut within the next 6 months. We will ease monetary policy smoothly, keeping an eye on the state of the economy and inflation dynamics. Also, we will estimate the effect of the decisions we have already taken and the impact of market participants' forecasts for the key rate on monetary conditions. These currently meet our expectations. Inflation has fallen to the target level of 4%, but in effect we are only taking up the task of ensuring price stability. Let me repeat that inflation has yet to be anchored near the target. We need to reduce and anchor inflation expectations and enhance credibility of the central bank's policy, and in this context our main focus will lie on pro-inflationary risks rather than the opposite factors. As the 4% inflation becomes a regular benchmark for businesses, financial institutions, and households, we will be able to complete this transition from the moderately tight to a neutral monetary policy. Our key principles and approaches to monetary policy for the next 3 years will be described in the monetary policy guidelines, which we are about to release today. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I am ready for your questions. Dear colleagues, please, your questions, and do not forget to identify yourselves and also name your agency. Olga, please. Olga Tanas, Bloomberg. If I may, 2 questions. In your statement, you are saying that this Bank of Russia is going to make a decision about the key rate based on its estimation of the considerable and sustainable deviation from inflation. Could you explain what is tangible and what is sustainable in such deviations? And my second question, the Bank of Russia reduced the key rate today by 50 percentage points, but the tone of the statement itself sounds quite conservative. And so towards the end of your presentation, you were saying that you're going to reduce the rate smoothly. Does it mean that subsequent steps to further reduce the key rate will be at the leg of 25 basis points? Thank you very much. The assessment of tangible, substantial and sustainable, I shall repeat it again, we're not formalizing this criteria, and we will come out with a qualitative assessment and each time explain where we come from, and so the transparency of our communication policy here is quite important, and we will be in a position to explain to you what is it that we mean by substantial and sustainable. I already quoted an example. The deviations in inflation which may lead, for example, to growing inflationary expectations. So if this expectation is not big and will not reflect upon the inflation, in this case we will believe it to be not substantial, even if to a certain extent it is sustainable. So you can quote quite a few examples of this nature, but what we would like to do, why we are trying to avoid this corridor in formal definitions, because this would hamstring our hands in making adequate decisions in terms of our monetary policy and may generate a wrong signal if we define the range plus minus 1.5 like many countries do. Let's say inflation temporarily has substantially gone up or went down by more than 1, 2, or 3%. But it's not guaranteed. It's not the fact that we should make a decision, but the market would expect us, by having previously introduced the corridor, that we would spring into action. So we believe that that would generate wrong expectations. So once again, here we will indeed make the most of coming out with a good quality assessment. But it doesn't mean that at a certain point in time we wouldn't revert back to more formalized principles and criteria, because, let me repeat it again, we are in the very beginning of this track, and these kind of approaches are the ones that we will translate, we will discuss, and we will pay strong attention to the ability of the public to understand our signal. Now, as far as the next steps are concerned with respect to the monetary policy, we similarly are talking about our principle, gradualness and smoothness. And we believe this is correct, because undoubtedly we see that there are ways to ease the monetary policy, but the measures, steps, and even intervals and pauses will depend upon the current environment, the current inflation in the economy, and most importantly, our expectations and outlook with respect to the stability of different factors which impact inflation. So, yet again, 0.25 and 0.5 are possible here. Colleagues, please, your other questions. Gulia, please. Good afternoon. Gulnara Vahitova, RIA Novosti Agency. Elvira Sahibzadovna, on more than one occasion you stated that the real percentage rate should be up to 3 percentage points, 2.5, 2.75. Considering your today's decision, the real rate is about 5%. Now, I would like to specify what is the time frame within which it may go down to the 2.75 that you referred to in your statement. And my second question about the mortgage booming. Many economists and bankers expect that the mortgage lending will boom in the country until the end of this year. Also, bearing in mind today's central bank decision where it reduced the key rate, to what extent, based on your expectations, whatever they are talking about may come true, and when the central bank expects this mortgage boom to happen? Thank you for your questions. We confirm our estimate. We hold it to to the level of the equilibrium rate, which is 2.53%, but in nominal terms, 6.57%. Our rate shall remain above the neutral level as long as we assess the inflationary expectations as exaggerated in terms of our target and, most importantly, unanchored. And as the inflationary expectations go down and become anchored, i.e., respond less to the temporary factors, the sooner we'll be able to switch over to the neutral rates. The experience we see in other countries shows that it may take different periods of time in duration, based on what we believe that was about 2 to 3 years, so most probably 2019. But yet again, this is no kind of a promise in terms of our rates this year getting closer and be equaling the neutral rates. These are our estimates in terms of when we will be in a position to do that. Now, and as far as the development of the mortgage market is concerned, I wouldn't describe it as a mortgage boom. This is just a good growth. And indeed, mortgage market grows well. We have data covering 7 months of this year. The number of newly released mortgage loans grew by 12%. While the size of an individual mortgage loan also grew slightly upward, 7%. This is a good growth. You shouldn't describe it as a booming growth because we see that the rates are going down and we expect that they will continue to go down. Now, bearing in mind today's decision on the key rate, and that will certainly support high demand for mortgage products. And so here our estimates in terms of the mortgage market will be developing are quite optimistic, and we simply believe that it is going to be quite a healthy, good growth, and the quality of loans is good ones and doesn't give the reason to be concerned. Colleagues, please. Margarita. Good afternoon. TASS agency. Could you please tell us, does the Central Bank of Russia see the reason to reconsider its inflationary outlook towards the end of the year? And my second question today, there will be S&P's rating decision announced. What are your expectations from that? Our guideline in terms of the inflation towards the end of this year is something that we made more specific. We estimate that the inflation may be within the interval between 3.5 to 3.8%. I will repeat it again. We believe this kind of an estimate to be conforming to our target. And our expectations, well, they're always pessimistic in terms of rating activities. Because, in my mind, it is true that the macroeconomics, all of the indicators in them do demonstrate stability and progressive improvement, and the stability of budgetary conditions, fiscal conditions, and the rate of economic growth, which makes us feel optimistic. So there are quite a few positive drivers which quite objectively describe the progress that we are achieving in our economy. Colleagues, please, Dmitry. Dmitry Butinko, Kommersant newspaper. In your press release, for the first time during the past several months, you are referring not only to the various restrictions that the labor market may impose upon the GDP, but also the production capacities. Which are the industries or sectors that you see such risks in? Thank you very much for this question. Also, previously, we thought that we do not have too many effective free capacities, the ones which will be conducive to great growth. So we need investments and we need structural changes in the economy. We observe certain limitations amongst the production capacities, which may deter the production growth and affect the inflation volatility, something that I already referred to, such as in transportation and logistics, not only in farming and agriculture, because I should say that the transportation infrastructure limitations, they do exist practically for a prevalent majority of industries. So these are the industries that I am referring to. You wanted to add another question, please go ahead. Yes, we have a polling results in between different businesses, and the leaders in pessimistic assessments are the processing industry companies, 30%. Thank you. Other questions, please, Elena? Elena Fabriczna, Reuters. If we are to compare the listing of inflationary risks in between the previous press release and the current one, we don't see any more ruble fluctuation because of geopolitical risk. Does it mean that at this point in time you see no threat coming from geopolitical risks anymore? And the second point was that no mentioning of the tax maneuver is there. So the fiscal and budget policy towards the end of the year, how it is going to affect your monetary policy, and when another issue of the bonds issue, government bonds, will take place. Well, indeed, our specification of risks continues because some of the risks are becoming less important, others are becoming more important. Doesn't mean that all the risk will disappear because we're trying to identify the main risks, and currently what we see as the priority is the fluctuation above the inflation and below the inflation. But as far as the geopolitics are concerned and the external risks in the first place, well, the external risks do remain always, and we take them into account, particularly the ones which affect the price dynamics for our commodities. But as far as geopolitical risks are concerned, we see that as far as the Russian economy is concerned, usually they manifest themselves through the state of the global financial markets, their volatilities, their movements, and through the oil prices. So these are the two main channels through which geopolitical risks affect us. As far as the oil prices are concerned, you can see that we come out with our guidelines and we take into account different factors which produce influence upon the oil prices. But as far as the global financial markets risks are concerned and the possible geopolitical situations, we note that the global financial markets overall have adjusted themselves to such risks being around, and the reaction of the global financial market to different geopolitical events, external ones, is less visible. So we take that into account, but we do not put them into the category of the substantial factors which will strongly affect us in the foreseeable future. And you are quite right, we're no longer mentioning the tax maneuver. We'll have a discussion about it in detail when we had the debate about the risks that we would like to identify as the main ones. But we simply see that there's no longer a heated debate about it. The government is no longer quite willing to discuss this tax maneuver. We are aware that certain tax changes still may take place, but in as far as this is concerned, we very precisely translate our position and our request for the government to have such decisions be discussed in advance and to make them known in advance so that we take them into account in our monetary policy. And this predictability of change and inability to learn beforehand, in as far as tax environment is concerned, is very important for the businesses because we see what businesses think. But it is also important for the predictability of the monetary policy and in order to avoid all unnecessary fluctuations, I should say. Which is what is the way that the fiscal policy may affect the monetary policy. We do see that the fiscal policy is well balanced, and the fiscal policy doesn't carry within itself pro-inflationary effects. Without doubt, there are certain factors that we take into account in our guidelines and in our outlooks and in our decisions in terms of spending. I mentioned the tax, but overall, no inflationary nature. And as far as your question is concerned, yes, in November, we're planning a new issue of the Bank of Russia bonds, which will be in exchange of the previous ones, but maybe a little bit bigger in size. Dear colleagues, please, Elizaveta. Elizabeth Bzanova from Vedomosti. Elvira Sahibzadovna, my question to you is about the Ministry of Economy forecast, according to which in 2018 we should see substantial wage growth in real and in nominal terms. To what extent this might pose a serious inflationary risk, and does the Bank of Russia take this into account? And also, with respect to the inflationary risk, I have another question. In the press release, the Bank of Russia specifies that the fluctuations in the food price industry will considerably affect the inflation within the next 6 months. To what extent this dynamics may be sustainable next year as well? Thank you. Firstly, real wage growth is a normal thing, along with the economic growth that comes only natural because wages are being indexed. And we take these factors into account: wage indexing and raising the level of the minimum wage. We continuously assess things. No substantial inflationary risk we see here. And so the aggregate assessment of the possible effect coming from higher, minimum wages and others is just 0.3% in inflation, which is not really much. As far as the food price inflation is concerned, that is a very important component in the consumer basket, and it is also quite volatile. And so we forecast that this volatility shall remain unless all of the factors related to the seasonal moments are concerned, but investments are necessary and required because the government, we know, is currently having a debate about greater investments into the processing and transportation, in warehousing and storing, because we believe this is principally important to reduce the volatility in inflation, reduce the inflationary risks. If the volatility of the food inflation is there, we will make a much quicker resolution of having a much lower key rate as well. Tatiana, please, go ahead. Tatiana Shipakis, Interfax Agency. I've got several questions. Have you specified your outlook for the oil price for 2017 in the midterm outlook? Have you specified the income that the Russian banking system generates, taking into account that it has generated almost 8 trillion rubles during the first 8 months? And my other question about the new instrument for the support of the liquidity amongst the bank, because the central bank representative stated that they were making such an instrument made available to the banks to support them even before the board of directors made a decision to endorse this instrument in its product lines of product to offer refinancing. So could you give us what was the volume of money made through this channel, and will you be publicly disclosing it? Because the information about the collateral-free, non-securitized one was published by the central bank website. Thank you. As far as the oil price for the end of 2017 outlook is concerned, we currently forecast $50 per barrel. And I believe that is the level that we had last time. Now, further specific estimates in GDP and raising our outlook is related to the results of the second quarter, i.e., meaning to say that the actual result exceeded our expectation and was not related to the oil price. Now, within the midterm outlook, we do keep our position. We believe that in case that the agreement is not extended, that the price may slightly go further down and reach the level of $40 per barrel in real terms towards the end of the year. And as far as the banking industry revenue profit is concerned, we're not currently making a quantitative estimate throughout the whole of 2017. It will naturally be higher than last year because already you can observe this kind of a dynamics, which is in excess of 1 trillion. This is quite obvious. And as far as making the liquidity instruments available, I mean, we were making the decision to offer liquidity to the Discovery Bank before the decision was made about this particular instrument, but that was part of the first decision which was being considered. Secondly, within the range of authority that is vested with the central bank, and the reporting is going to be disclosed in a normal fashion, because we already stated it will be disclosed exactly as it should, because the Odkrytie, the Discovery Bank, is disclosing its reporting in full. Can't hear the question. This is not being spoken into the microphone. I'm sorry. This is not the standard refinancing instrument like in the case of repo, because we are disclosing on the repo, which is the Article 312, and the mechanism of disclosing this information. But I would like to say that in as far as this particular situation is concerned, that is the instrument of providing liquidity to the banks which find themselves in a temporary stress. And this is sensitive information for the institution which is financially stable and it is recovering itself in the financial stability. Application of this instrument is constitutes a sensitive information, and you should think about when to disclose it. I mean, one should disclose it, I agree with that, but you should think about when, not when the bank in question is trying to resolve its liquidity pressures, because we do understand that that may provoke a sort of behavior on the part of the depositors, but with that the bank is financially stable. But the problem of liquidity may arise because of a number of different factors, because of various information attacks, etc., etc. So the question about disclosing information about the application of this specific instrument in this particular case is something that we are not going to do, like, for example, disclosing this information the very next day we provide liquidity to a bank in question. Andrei Burikov, Bloomberg Agency. Elvira Nabiullina, please could you explain, because many economists do see this discrepancy between the retail trade results and the consumer trust, and that is related to a considerable increase of the internet commerce. Do you see this kind of dynamics, and is it carrying within itself certain risks for the inflation to become stronger? Yes, you're quite right. There is a bit of a discrepancy between the growth indicators that the consumer activity is showing and the internet commerce is showing. We are watching over these statistics, trying to understand why there is such a discrepancy, but we do see a certain effect coming from the electronic commerce. The share of it is growing, and we are going to discuss how to take that further into account. This is indeed an issue, but not the kind which would change around the quality of our ability to assess trends in the economy. Grigori, please. Grigory Kogan, Izvestia newspaper. Elvira Sahibzadovna, amongst the banking community, there is a wish for the key rate to go down to the level of 6.57%. Could you please tell us, against the current inflation level around 4%, a little bit less than 4%, is it feasible, or should it go down even further? And my other question, we are talking about the inflation risks, but how high are the risks of subsequent deflation? Is there any level of prices? I mean, are there any conditions which may come into play against which the central bank may undertake a reverse policy to the price stimulation? Thank you. Yes, we do see that our rate may be 6.57% with the inflation being at 4%, but that will happen only when the inflation expectations subside and become anchored. And like I used to say, our estimate is that it will happen within the 2 to 3 year time horizon. Now, the risk of subsequent deflation is not there because we don't have a deflation in order for it to carry on. The monthly price decline is not a deflation, because usually deflation is something when you see prices going down within annualized period. We don't see such a phenomenon, and we do not see there being any risks to us to encounter deflation, at least within the coming few years. In as far as the possibility of our reverse activities to stimulate deflation, it is only possible in case inflation is stable, sustainable, and substantially will stay below 4%. In this case, it's possible, but we don't see such thing right now. Colleagues, please. Olga? Well, since this bank already has been mentioned, Otkritie, the Discovery Bank, we wanted to ask you a question. This week, the Ministry of Finance made an offer to the 2030 bondholders. Did it discuss the terms of this offer with the Bank of Russia? Because the fact that this offer has been valid during the past week, the Central Bank of Russia, being the temporary manager in the bank, is it planning to participate in this offer? Well, our plans, whether we participate or won't participate, this constitutes sensitive information. So let me refrain from answering this question. Will there be any more questions about the monetary policy, dear colleagues? Dmitry, please go ahead. Well, I guess it's appropriate to ask what are the technical terms of inflationary expectations you apply to understand whether the inflation is anchored or not. What do you measure in the volatility of the public opinion polls or what? It's a very good question, thank you. To us, not as much as the level of inflationary expectations is important as their stability in relationship to various factors. And let me give you the details of what I mean by this. Because the inflationary expectations will hardly be staying at the level of 4% in the foreseeable future, because in many countries which are targeting inflation successfully, inflation expectations more often are higher because people they perceive inflation higher than the indicators used to measure it. Right now it's a bit high, 9.5. I mean, it's too high. I mean, 9.5%, the inflation expectations. A big gap there. And most importantly, when these inflation expectations are high, they're very sensitive. And the sensitivity that we're going to measure will be against one-time factors. For example, the very same low crop yield, a short food price hike, and when people understand that this is for a short period of time and that the prices will go back to 4%, that the central bank will do everything necessary, and that if prices don't go back for a long period of time, that the bank will bring them back, then the inflation expectations don't jump up. The fluctuations are slight without really growing strongly, because we see the way the inflation expectations respond to the food prices and the exchange rate very expediently. And so these are the fluctuations that we are monitoring. And when these fluctuations are below the expected range, then we will be in a position to say that they have become anchored. Dear colleagues, our time is coming to an end. Please, the last question. Gulia? I have additional two technical questions. I would like to ask you to specify whether today's board decision was unanimous about the key rate and whether the Bank of Russia estimated the contribution made by the appreciating rubles into making inflation stable. In as far as the voting results are concerned, this time I will tell you, I already mentioned it. I mean, the results of voting. Today, the voting was unanimous. However, I would like to make the following statement. We will hardly be further talking about the voting results anymore and about views expressed by individual board members, because we decided to stick to the policy of the single vote. Because with respect to the inflation expectations yet not anchored, it is a bit premature to launch ourselves into disclosing what each voting board member thinks. Maybe it'll happen in the future, but right now it's premature. Now, as far as the appreciation of the ruble as a factor is concerned, we definitely took into account. I would I would say that we took into account the dynamics of the exchange rate because it was quite diverse in its movement. There are certain factors which are appreciating and depreciating the ruble, they juxtapose, and so we took this model into account. Right? Is this it? Thank you very much. I mean, there are certain questions still remaining. Well, all right. I mean, the ones that were waiting for their turn. Yes, please. Well, since we're talking about the Odkrytie, the Discovery Bank, well, monetary. No, this press conference is about the monetary policy. If you have questions about the monetary policy that other colleagues would like to raise, I am eager to answer, please. Andrei, yes, go ahead. Andrei Ostro, Reuters. I have another specific question about the ruble and the way it affects inflation this year. What is the current account deficit to expect to be in third quarter, and do you see the possibility that it may take ruble into the weakening mode? Well, once again, I would like to underscore that the current account behavior is current dynamics in itself is not something that may affect the exchange rate within the floating exchange rate, and against the current account deficit they may happen no depreciation of the ruble. Even appreciation may happen because it will be balanced by the financial account, taking into account the dynamics we see in the currency reserves. So no conclusions related to the current account balance and its effect over the exchange rate. We do not see any tangible risks right now to expect any tangible fluctuations in the exchange rate. Now, in terms of what will be the current account picture during the third quarter, well, it is true that it is seasonably weak. It could be just around zero, just slightly in the negative, but in terms of the main indicators, we do not see any problems here whatsoever. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for your questions.